The envelope was still in my trembling hands when I realized my entire life had been a lie. 3 months ago, I was sleeping under the Morrison Bridge when a lawyer in an Armani suit found me. Not social services, not the police, a lawyer carrying papers that would make me a millionaire. I thought it was some cruel joke. Hell, I thought I was losing my mind. My name is Marcus Thompson, and I haven't had a real address in 3 years, 4 months, and 16 days. Not since the construction accident that shattered my L4 vertebra and my entire world along with it. Not since the insurance company found every excuse in the book to deny my claim. Not since I watched my wife pack her bags because she couldn't handle seeing me like this anymore. But here's what nobody tells you about rock bottom. Sometimes it's the only place where you can see clearly. It was December 23rd, bitter cold, snow turning to slush on the sidewalks. I was outside Murphy's Coffee on 5th Street, trying to stay warm, when I saw this old man collapse right in front of the door. Expensive coat, leather shoes, clearly not from my world. But when you've been invisible as long as I have, you recognize pain when you see it. Real pain. I didn't hesitate. I couldn't. While everyone else stepped around him like he was just another obstacle, I was already moving. Stayed with Harold Whitmore until the paramedics arrived, held his hand when he whispered, "Thank you, son. You remind me of who I used to be." Harold died 2 weeks later. I never saw him again. But Harold had been watching me. For months, he'd observed how I shared my last sandwich with Maria, the woman who talks to pigeons. How I gave my blanket to Tommy when he was shivering through withdrawals. How I still held doors open for people who looked right through me. Harold saw something I'd forgotten existed. Here's what the lawyer told me. Harold Whitmore was worth $14 million. No family, no children, nobody to inherit his fortune. Just a homeless man who showed him kindness when the rest of the world walked by. Just me. The mansion sits on 12 acres in the hills above Portland. 43 rooms, including a library bigger than the shelter I used to sleep in. There's a condition, though. One that's already changing me in ways I never expected. One that's forcing me to confront a truth about myself that I've been running from for years. You want to know what that condition is? You want to know why a dying millionaire chose a broken-down construction worker over every charity in Portland? And you definitely want to know what I found in the mansion's basement that explains everything about Harold's mysterious past and why he'd been watching me from the very beginning. Because this isn't just a story about inheriting money. This is about inheriting a responsibility I'm not sure I'm strong enough to carry. It's about discovering that sometimes the people society throws away are the ones who remember what it means to be human. If you've ever felt invisible, if you've ever wondered whether small acts of kindness actually matter, if you've ever been one paycheck away from losing everything you thought made you who you are, this story is for you. Hit that like button if you believe in second chances. Share this if you think everyone deserves to be seen. Subscribe because over the next 10 chapters, I'm going to show you how one moment of human decency didn't just change my life. It revealed a secret that could change how you see every homeless person you'll ever encounter again. What I'm about to tell you will make you question everything you think you know about worth, about dignity, and about the thin line between having everything and losing it all. Trust me, you're not ready for what Harold left me in that basement. The envelope weighed nothing, but it felt like it could crush my chest. 3 months had passed since that lawyer found me under the Morrison Bridge, and I was still carrying those papers around like some kind of talisman. Like if I held onto them long enough, they might disappear and return me to the simple hell I understood. I'd read the will so many times the edges had gone soft from my fingertips, tracing the words. To Marcus Thompson, who showed me kindness when the world had forgotten what that looked like. Harold's signature was shaky, like he'd been fighting death just to finish writing my name. The mansion keys sat heavy in my pocket as I stood outside the iron gates for the first time. 12 acres of perfectly manicured grounds stretched before me, and I felt like an intruder at my own inheritance. The house rose from the hillside like something from a movie, all stone and tall windows that seemed to be watching me, judging whether I deserved to cross the threshold. My hands shook as I fumbled with the gate lock. Behind me, Portland stretched out like a map of my failures. I could see the bridge where I'd slept, the coffee shop where Harold collapsed, the shelter where I'd spent my worst nights listening to other broken men cry in their sleep. 3 years, 4 months, and 16 days of invisibility, and now I owned more square footage than some small towns. The irony tasted bitter in my mouth. I remembered Harold's last words to me in the ambulance. "You remind me of who I used to be." At the time, I thought he was delirious, maybe seeing his younger self in my weathered face. Now I wondered if he'd seen something else entirely. Something I'd lost track of during those endless nights when staying warm mattered more than staying human. The front door was massive, carved wood that probably cost more than my old house. As I turned the key, I heard it echo through what must have been a cavernous space beyond. The sound was lonely, like a church bell ringing for nobody. But it was the smell that hit me first when I stepped inside. Not dust or abandonment, but something clean and alive, like someone had been maintaining this place, waiting for my arrival. The entryway was marble and mahogany, with a staircase that curved up toward shadows I couldn't penetrate. I stood there in my thrift store jacket and shoes, held together with duct tape, and felt the weight of every room I couldn't see yet. 43 rooms, the lawyer had said. I'd been living in spaces measured in square feet, and now I owned square acres. That's when I heard it, a sound that made my blood freeze. Footsteps, coming from somewhere deeper in the house. I wasn't alone in Harold's house. That much became clear as I followed the sound of those footsteps through hallways lined with oil paintings of stern-faced strangers. Each portrait seemed to track my movement, their eyes asking the same question that had been eating at me since I signed those papers. What makes you think you belong here? The footsteps belonged to Elena, Harold's housekeeper for 30 years. She emerged from what I'd learned was the kitchen, a woman in her 60s with silver hair pulled back severely, and eyes that had seen enough to know better than to judge a man by his circumstances. She'd been maintaining the house since Harold's death, she explained, paid by his estate to keep everything ready for my arrival. "Mr. Whitmore spoke of you often in his final months," she said, her voice carrying a slight accent I couldn't place. "He was certain you would come, even when others doubted." Others doubted. The phrase hung in the air like smoke. I wondered who these others were, what they'd said about the homeless man who'd inherited their benefactor's fortune. Eleanor showed me through rooms that felt like museums, a dining room with a table that could seat 20, a library with leather-bound books reaching toward a ceiling painted with angels, a sitting room with furniture so pristine I was afraid to touch anything. Each room felt like it was holding its breath, waiting to see if I would honor or destroy its dignity. But it was Harold's study that stopped me cold. The desk was exactly as he'd left it, papers scattered with his careful handwriting, a coffee cup with a dark ring stained into the bottom, reading glasses folded beside an open book. The air still held traces of his cologne, expensive and subtle, nothing like the harsh soap from shelter bathrooms. Eleanor watched me absorb the scene. He spent his last weeks here, writing letters. So many letters. Some to you, though you'll find those later. Her voice carried weight I couldn't interpret yet. The bedroom she led me to was larger than most apartments I'd lived in. The bed was made with military precision, white sheets turned down like they were expecting someone who mattered. Through tall windows, I could see Portland's lights twinkling below, tiny and distant as fallen stars. That first night, I lay on top of the covers fully clothed, still wearing my boots. The ceiling was too high, the silence too complete. I'd grown accustomed to the constant noise of the streets, sirens, shouting, the rustle of other people fighting their own battles with sleep and safety. Here, the quiet felt oppressive, like it was waiting for me to fill it with something worthy. I thought about Harold, dying in this same room, and wondered if he'd felt this crushing loneliness, or if wealth provided some insulation against the basic human terror of facing death alone. Around 3 in the morning, I heard it again. Footsteps in the hallway, too heavy to be Elena's. I held my breath until they passed, telling myself old houses settle, that grief and guilt could make you hear things that weren't there. But I knew someone else was in this house with me, someone Harold hadn't mentioned. Eleanor found me in the kitchen the next morning, staring at a coffee maker that probably cost more than most people's monthly rent. I'd been up since dawn, unable to sleep in a bed that felt like quicksand. The more comfortable it became, the deeper I seemed to sink into something I couldn't name. "The condition," I said without preamble. "The lawyer mentioned Harold left a condition with the inheritance. What is it?" She poured coffee into a cup so delicate I was afraid my calloused hands might shatter it. "Mr. Whitmore was very specific. You inherit everything, the house, the investments, all of it, but only if you can last 1 full year living here. Alone." The word alone hit me like a physical blow. After 3 years of sleeping rough, surrounded by the constant presence of other desperate souls, the thought of solitary confinement in luxury felt like a unique form of torture. "There's more," Eleanor continued, her voice gentle but firm. "You cannot leave the property for more than 4 hours at a time. No extended trips, no running back to your old life when things get difficult." Harold believed that real change requires commitment, even when that commitment feels impossible. I set down the coffee cup before I could drop it. The irony was devastating. I'd been given everything I thought I wanted, but the price was becoming a prisoner in paradise. Harold had seen through me completely, understood that my first instinct would be to flee when the weight of his generosity became too much to bear. "Why?" I asked, though I already suspected the answer. Elena's expression softened. "Because Mr. Whitmore spent his last years in this house alone, and he came to understand that isolation changes you. He wanted to see if you could survive what he did. Not just the solitude, but the responsibility that comes with having enough money to change lives, but no clear direction on whose lives to change." She led me to Harold's study, where she pulled out a leather portfolio I hadn't noticed the day before. Inside were photographs, dozens of them, street scenes, homeless camps, soup kitchen lines, and in several of them, barely visible but unmistakably present, was me. Harold had been documenting Portland's homeless population for months before his death. Not as a voyeur or a charity case study, but as someone trying to understand a world he'd never inhabited, but somehow felt called to witness. "He said you reminded him of his younger self," Elena explained. "Before the money, before the loneliness, when he still believed that people were fundamentally good." I studied a photograph of myself sharing a sandwich with Maria. I looked smaller than I remembered, more fragile. But there was something in my posture, the way I was focused entirely on making sure she got the bigger half, that I recognized as a part of myself I'd thought was long dead. The condition wasn't punishment. It was Harold's final test. Could I survive abundance the way I'd survived deprivation? Could I find purpose in comfort the way I'd found dignity in suffering? As I stared at those photographs, I realized Harold hadn't just been watching me those months. He'd been studying me, learning who I was when I thought nobody was paying attention. But here's what I need you to consider. If someone had been watching your lowest moments, documenting how you treated others when you had nothing left to give, what would they have seen? What would your photographs reveal about who you really are? I found the basement door on my 4th day in the house, hidden behind what I'd assumed was a coat closet near Harold's study. The brass key hanging from a simple chain around the handle suggested Harold had wanted it to be found, but only by someone thorough enough to explore every corner of their inheritance. The stairs descended into darkness that felt different from the rest of the house, older, heavier, like it had been holding secrets longer than the mansion had been standing. My footsteps echoed with a hollowness that made me think of empty graves and abandoned churches. At the bottom, I found a light switch that illuminated something I never could have prepared for. The basement wasn't a storage area or wine cellar. It was a fully equipped apartment. Clean, comfortable, lived in. A bed with rumpled sheets. Personal items scattered on surfaces. The lingering smell of recently cooked food. Someone had been living here. Recently. A voice behind me said, "I was wondering when you'd finally make it down here." I spun around to see a man roughly my age, maybe a few years older, with the kind of weathered face that comes from years of hard living. He was thin, but not emaciated, clean, but wearing clothes that had seen better decades. Everything about him screamed homeless, except for one crucial detail. He was here, in Harold's basement, acting like he belonged. "Name's David," he said, extending a hand I was too shocked to shake. "Harold took me in about 8 months ago. Guess that makes us housemates now." My mind reeled. Harold had been harboring a homeless man in his basement while watching me on the streets above. The conditions suddenly made more sense. I wasn't meant to be alone at all. I was meant to discover that Harold's charity hadn't stopped with leaving me money. David explained that he'd been Harold's experiment, a trial run for what he planned to do with the inheritance. He wanted to see if giving someone a safe place to heal would actually work, or if we're all too broken to come back from the streets. Harold's journals, which David showed me, detailed a year-long study of what happened when you gave a homeless person stability without strings attached. David had been Harold's guinea pig, and according to the careful notes, the experiment had been working. "Why didn't Eleanor tell me about you?" I asked. "Because Harold specifically instructed her not to. He wanted you to find me yourself, wanted to see how you'd react when you realized you weren't the only one he'd saved." I stared at David, seeing myself reflected in his cautious posture, the way he held his shoulders like he was ready to run at the first sign of rejection. Harold had been preparing me for this moment, teaching me that salvation shared is salvation strengthened. The basement wasn't just David's hideaway. It was Harold's laboratory for human redemption. Charts on the walls tracked David's progress. Weight gained, nightmares decreased, job applications submitted. It was scientific and compassionate in equal measure, the methodical documentation of one man's return from societal death. But it was the final entry in Harold's journal that made my hands shake. "David is ready. The question is whether Marcus has the strength to continue what we started. 2 broken men in one house might save each other, or they might destroy the fragile progress we've made. Tomorrow, I'll find out which." Harold had died the day after writing those words. The day I'd helped him outside Murphy's Coffee. David and I spent the next week learning how to exist in the same space without stepping on each other's carefully constructed defenses. It was like watching 2 stray dogs circle each other, both desperate for companionship, but terrified of the vulnerability that comes with trust. Harold's basement apartment became our neutral territory. During the day, I'd roam the mansion's endless rooms, while David worked on job applications using Harold's computer. In the evenings, we'd find ourselves gravitating toward the kitchen, where Elena would leave dinner for 2, though neither of us had told her about our arrangement. David's story spilled out in fragments over those shared meals. A veteran who'd come back from Afghanistan with wounds that wouldn't heal, he'd lost his family, his job, his identity. The streets had been his penance, his way of punishing himself for surviving when better men hadn't. Harold had found him attempting to die quietly in Pioneer Courthouse Square during a February snowstorm. "He didn't offer me charity," David explained one night. his voice rough with remembered emotion. He offered me a job, said he needed someone to help him understand something important, and that I was the only person qualified for the position. Harold had been dying when he found David, though he hadn't shared that information. Instead, he'd presented David's recovery as a mutual project. Harold would provide stability, David would provide data. It was brilliant psychology, giving David purpose instead of pity. But the real genius of Harold's plan became clear when David showed me the letters. Dozens of them, all addressed to me, written during Harold's final months. He'd been documenting David's progress specifically for my benefit, creating a roadmap for what success could look like. He knew he was dying, David said, handing me a particularly thick envelope. These last few weeks, he kept talking about you, wondering if you'd be strong enough to carry on what he'd started. I opened the letter with trembling fingers. Harold's handwriting was shakier than in his earlier entries, but his message was crystal clear. Marcus, by the time you read this, you'll have found David. He's not a responsibility or a charity case. He's proof that redemption is possible when people stop trying to save each other and start trying to understand each other instead. The letter continued. I'm leaving you both everything, but not because I think you need saving. I'm leaving it to you because I think you might save others. The condition isn't about your isolation. It's about learning to build something together that neither of you could create alone. Reading those words, I finally understood Harold's true condition. It wasn't about surviving a year in solitude. It was about learning to share salvation with someone who understood the weight of having nothing and suddenly having everything. David and I sat in Harold's study that night, surrounded by the evidence of one man's belief in human resilience. The photographs of Portland's homeless community looked different now, not like documentation of despair, but like portraits of potential. What do you think he wants us to do? David asked. I looked at the mansion around us, then at the man who'd become my unlikely partner in inheriting more than money. I think he wants us to prove that broken people can fix more than themselves. So here's what I want you to think about as we continue. When you've been broken by life, does healing happen in isolation? Or does it require witnessing someone else's journey back from the edge? And if Harold was right, what does that mean for every person we pass on the street who's fighting battles we can't see? 3 weeks into our strange cohabitation, Eleanor found us in the kitchen with a problem that would test Harold's theories about shared salvation. She'd been volunteering at the downtown shelter, she explained, and there was a situation that required immediate attention. There's a girl, Eleanor said, her voice tight with controlled emotion. Maybe 19, 20. She's been on the streets for 6 months and she's pregnant. The shelter's full, and she's too proud to accept help from strangers, but she's going to die out there if someone doesn't intervene soon. David and I exchanged glances. We'd been talking theoretically about Harold's vision for weeks, but this was real. This was a human being in immediate danger, and we had the resources to help. The question was whether we had the courage. Where is she? I asked. Elena provided details that made my stomach clench. The girl, Sarah, was camping under the Burnside Bridge, not far from where I'd spent some of my worst nights. She was sick, malnourished, and according to Eleanor's sources, hadn't been seen at any of the soup kitchens in days. David volunteered to make contact first. His military background had taught him how to approach people in crisis without triggering their flight response. I would wait in the car, ready to provide backup if needed. We found Sarah exactly where Elena said she'd be, huddled under a makeshift shelter constructed from shopping carts and tarps. Even from a distance, I could see she was in bad shape, too thin, shaking either from cold or sickness, her face carrying the hollow look that comes from choosing between food and safety too many times. David approached slowly, hands visible, voice calm. I watched from the car as he crouched down to her level, speaking in tones too low for me to hear. Whatever he said made her start crying. Not the tears of fear, but of relief. Someone was finally seeing her as human. It took 2 hours of careful negotiation before Sarah agreed to come with us. Not to the mansion. That would have been too overwhelming. But to a motel room David paid for with Harold's emergency cash. She needed medical attention, food, and time to process that help was being offered without strings attached. At the emergency room, I watched David hold Sarah's hand while doctors examined her. The pregnancy was high risk, complicated by malnutrition and stress, but viable. The baby was due in 4 months, and with proper care, both mother and child had good chances of survival. Sarah looked at us with the same suspicious gratitude I'd felt when Harold's lawyer first approached me. "Why are you helping me?" she asked. "What do you want in return?" David's answer was perfect. Because someone helped us when we needed it most, and this is how we pay that forward. Driving back to the mansion that night, David and I were quiet. We'd crossed a line from theoretical charity to actual responsibility. Sarah wasn't just someone we'd helped. She was someone whose survival now partially depended on our continued involvement. "Harold knew this would happen," I said finally. David nodded. "He was counting on it. Question is, are we ready for what comes next?" I thought about Harold's journals, his careful documentation of human recovery. Sarah would need more than emergency intervention. She'd need sustained support, job training, childcare, 1,000 small acts of faith in her ability to rebuild her life. We had the resources. The question was whether we had the wisdom to use them correctly. Word travels fast on the streets. Within 2 weeks of helping Sarah, our phone was ringing constantly. Eleanor had become an unofficial intake coordinator, fielding calls from social workers, shelter administrators, and people who'd heard rumors about 2 men with resources and the willingness to use them. Each story broke my heart in a different way. Tommy, the veteran I'd known from my bridge days, had been arrested for trespassing and needed bail money. Maria, who talked to pigeons, had been hospitalized with pneumonia and faced eviction from the boarding house where she'd finally found stability. A 17-year-old kid named Jake had aged out of foster care and was sleeping in doorways because every shelter had a waiting list. David and I tried to develop systems for determining who we could help and how, but every case felt urgent, every person worthy of salvation. Harold's money was substantial, but it wasn't infinite, and we quickly realized that writing checks was the easiest part of rescue work. The hard part was the follow-up. Sarah, now installed in a small apartment we'd rented for her, called daily with new crises. Her pregnancy was progressing, but she was struggling with anxiety attacks and the overwhelming responsibility of preparing for motherhood while learning how to live indoors again. Some days, she wanted to return to the streets because familiarity felt safer than the terrifying vulnerability of accepting help. "I don't know how to be grateful," she confessed during one of our weekly check-ins. "Everyone expects me to be thankful all the time, but mostly I'm just scared that you're going to realize I'm not worth saving and take it all away." Her honesty gutted me because I recognized the feeling. Harold's generosity had come with its own burden of unworthiness. The constant fear that I was fraudulently occupying space meant for someone more deserving. David and I started attending support group meetings, not as participants, but as observers, trying to understand the psychology of recovery. What we learned was humbling. Giving people resources was only the first step. Helping them develop the emotional infrastructure to use those resources effectively was a much more complex undertaking. We hired a part-time social worker, Jennifer, who helped us develop better screening processes and follow-up protocols. She also forced us to confront an uncomfortable truth. We were making decisions about people's lives based on our own experiences of homelessness, which wasn't always applicable to their situations. "You're both white men who became homeless through specific circumstances," Jennifer explained during one of our early planning meetings. "Sarah is a pregnant teenager who probably has trauma history you don't understand. Tommy is dealing with PTSD in ways that might be completely different from David's experience. Your empathy is valuable, but it's not enough." She was right. Harold's vision had been beautiful in its simplicity, but the reality of human rescue work was messier, more complicated, requiring expertise we didn't possess. That's when Eleanor suggested we visit Harold's attorney to discuss the legal framework of our growing operation. We needed to understand the full scope of Harold's estate planning, including provisions we might not have discovered yet. The meeting revealed Harold's final surprise. He'd established a foundation, fully funded, with David and me named as co-directors. The mansion wasn't just our residence. It was meant to be headquarters for ongoing rescue operations. Harold had anticipated the multiplication of need. He'd prepared for it. The Harold Whitmore Foundation became real on a Tuesday morning when Jennifer walked us through the legal paperwork Harold had prepared before his death. The foundation was endowed with $10 million, with specific instructions that it should focus on what Harold called dignity-based intervention, helping people not just survive, but rebuild their sense of worth. David and I sat in Harold's study, now converted into our unofficial headquarters, surrounded by case files and intake forms. We'd helped 12 people in 2 months, and each success felt fragile, temporary, like we were building houses of cards in a windstorm. Sarah had given birth to a healthy daughter she named Hope. The irony wasn't lost on any of us. A baby named Hope born to a mother we'd rescued from hopelessness. But Sarah was struggling with postpartum depression and the crushing reality that her daughter's future depended on decisions she still felt unqualified to make. Tommy was sober for the first time in 3 years, living in a studio apartment we'd helped him secure, but he woke up screaming most nights and had been fired from 2 jobs for what employers called attitude problems. What they really meant was that he couldn't pretend to be undamaged for 40 hours a week. Maria had died. Eleanor delivered the news on a Thursday evening, while David and I were reviewing budget projections. Maria had suffered another bout of pneumonia, but this time she'd refused medical treatment. The social worker at the hospital said she'd kept asking for the men who remember her name, referring to David and me. But by the time we got the message, she was gone. We found her belongings in a plastic bag at the hospital. 3 photographs of pigeons, a journal filled with conversations she'd had with birds, and a letter addressed to the angels who feed sandwiches. In shaky handwriting, she'd written, "Thank you for seeing me when I was invisible. I died knowing someone remembered I was human." The funeral was small, just David, Eleanor, myself, and 2 other homeless women who'd known Maria from the shelter circuit. The pastor read Maria's letter aloud, and I realized that Harold's vision wasn't just about saving lives. It was about ensuring that people didn't die feeling forgotten. That night, David and I made a decision that would define the foundation's future direction. We wouldn't just provide emergency intervention. We'd create a support system that acknowledged the long-term nature of recovery from societal invisibility. Jennifer helped us develop a 3-phase program. Phase 1 was immediate stabilization, housing, medical care, basic needs. Phase 2 was skill rebuilding, job training, therapy, education. Phase 3 was community integration, helping people develop sustainable social connections that could survive our eventual absence from their lives. But the real breakthrough came when Sarah suggested something that hadn't occurred to any of us. The people we'd helped should help us help others. "I know what it's like to be approached by strangers offering help," she said during a foundation planning meeting. "Most of the time, it feels like charity. But if someone who'd been where I was offered help, it would feel like hope." Sarah became our first peer counselor. Tommy started leading support groups for veterans experiencing homelessness. Even Maria, in her final weeks, had been visiting other mentally ill women in the boarding houses, carrying our message that being forgotten by society didn't mean being forgotten by everyone. The foundation was becoming something Harold hadn't explicitly planned, but would have recognized. A community of people who'd learned that healing wasn't a destination, but a practice, something you had to do every day in partnership with others who understood the weight of starting over. 6 months after inheriting Harold's mansion, David and I finally understood his condition. We'd needed to learn to live together, not for our own sake, but so we could teach others that recovery was possible when you weren't trying to do it alone. 1 year after moving into Harold's mansion, I stood in the same spot where I'd first heard those mysterious footsteps, but now I knew they belonged to the 8 people currently living in various parts of the house while transitioning back to independent life. The mansion had become what Harold always intended, not a monument to wealth, but a laboratory for human restoration. The foundation had helped 43 people in 12 months. Not all success stories. We'd lost 2 to overdoses, 3 had disappeared back to the streets, and 1 had been arrested for crimes committed before we met him. But 43 people who'd been written off by society had been given chances to rewrite their stories. David had become our operations manager, his military precision perfectly suited for coordinating complex case management. He'd also gotten married to Jennifer, the social worker who joined our team, and fallen in love with his methodical approach to healing broken systems. Their wedding reception had been held in Harold's garden, attended by everyone we'd helped who was still alive and stable enough to celebrate. Sarah had enrolled in nursing school, motivated by her experience with the medical system during her pregnancy. Hope was walking now, taking her first steps in the mansion's library, while her mother studied for exams at Harold's desk. Sarah had become our most effective peer counselor, able to connect with young women in ways that David and I never could. But it was Tommy who'd surprised us most. His PTSD was still a daily battle, but he'd channeled his protective instincts into security work for the foundation. He'd developed a sixth sense for identifying when someone was planning to disappear back to the streets, and his intervention rate was remarkable. "Takes one to know one," he'd say, when people asked about his success rate. Elena had officially retired, but still lived in her quarters above the garage, serving as the foundation's unofficial grandmother and keeper of Harold's memory. She'd started a garden where people could work through their anxiety with their hands, growing vegetables that supplied our kitchen and several local shelters. The ripple effects extended beyond our direct interventions. People we'd helped had helped others, creating a network of peer support that operated independently of foundation funding. Sarah's nursing school classmates had started a free clinic for homeless women. Tommy's veterans group had expanded to 3 locations. Even Maria's legacy lived on. The women she'd befriended before her death had started a grief support group for people who'd lost friends on the streets. We'd learned to measure success differently. It wasn't just about getting people housed, it was about helping them develop the emotional resilience to stay housed when life inevitably became difficult again. It wasn't just about job training, it was about rebuilding people's sense of their own worth so they could advocate for fair treatment in workplaces that often discriminated against anyone with a history of homelessness. The mansion's basement, where David had once hidden, was now converted into administrative offices. The walls were covered with photographs, not Harold's documentation of despair, but portraits of transformation. Before and after pictures, but more importantly, pictures of people engaged in helping others, their faces showing the particular kind of dignity that comes from knowing your pain has been transformed into purpose. Harold's condition had been fulfilled in ways I'd never anticipated. I'd survived the year, learned to share the burden of salvation, and discovered that the most sustainable form of charity was teaching people to save themselves and each other. But the real victory was subtler. I'd learned to sleep through the night in Harold's bed, no longer feeling like an imposter in my own inheritance. The mansion felt like home now, not because I'd grown comfortable with luxury, but because it had become a place where broken things were mended, including me. 2 years later, I'm writing this from Harold's study, but it doesn't feel like his anymore. The desk where he'd planned my inheritance now holds blueprints for affordable housing projects, grant applications for mental health services, and a growing stack of letters from people whose lives have been touched by the foundation he created. The mansion has evolved into something Harold probably never imagined, but would have recognized immediately. The grand dining room serves community meals 3 times a week. The library has become a study space for people working toward their GEDs or college degrees. The basement apartment, where David once hid, now houses our 24-hour crisis intervention hotline. Sarah graduated nursing school last month. She's working in the emergency room where she once sought treatment, specializing in trauma care for homeless patients. Hope is 2 now, speaking in full sentences and treating every person who visits the foundation like extended family. Sarah recently told me that Hope's first word wasn't mama or dada, it was home, spoken while playing in the mansion's garden. David and Jennifer live in a house they bought in the neighborhood, but they're here most days, managing foundation operations. David's nightmares have mostly stopped, replaced by dreams about expanding our programs to other cities. He's been contacted by veterans organizations across the country who want to replicate our peer counseling model. Tommy died 6 months ago, not from overdose or violence, but from cancer that had been growing silently while he devoted his energy to saving others. His funeral filled the mansion's main hall. 200 people whose lives he'd touched in his 4 years with the foundation. The pastor read from Tommy's final letter. "I used to think surviving war was my greatest achievement. Now I know it was learning how to live afterward and teaching others they could survive their wars too." Elena passed peacefully in her sleep this winter, Harold's journals on her nightstand. She'd been reading his entries about the early days of finding David, marveling at how accurately he'd predicted the foundation's growth. Her final words to me were, "Mr. Whitmore would be proud. You've honored his faith in human resilience." I've been thinking about Harold's true legacy. Not the money, though that certainly mattered, but his radical belief that broken people could be trusted with the resources to fix not just themselves, but entire systems that create brokenness. He'd understood something about human nature that most charitable organizations miss. People recover faster when they're given responsibility for others' recovery. The foundation now operates in 3 cities, with plans to expand to 5 more by year's end. We've developed partnerships with medical schools, housing nonprofits, and job training programs. What started as Harold's experiment with 2 damaged men has become a model for peer-directed social services. But the most profound change has been internal. I no longer feel like I'm impersonating someone worthy of Harold's generosity. The mansion isn't just where I live. It's where I learned that home isn't about the walls around you, but about the people you choose to shelter within those walls. Last week, I received a letter from a man in Seattle who'd heard about our work. His story was familiar: job loss, medical bills, family abandonment, invisibility. But his final paragraph stopped me cold. "I'm not asking for money or housing. I'm asking for the chance to help others the way you were helped. I think that might be the only way I'll ever feel human again." I called him that afternoon. His name is Robert, and he's moving into the mansion next month to begin what we're calling the Harold Whitmore Fellowship, a program where people who've experienced homelessness spend a year learning how to develop and manage their own rescue operations in their home cities. As I finish writing this, I can hear Hope laughing in the garden while Sarah plants vegetables with our newest residents. David is in the kitchen cooking dinner for 8 people, all of whom once believed they were beyond saving. The house is alive with conversation, planning, hope, everything Harold wanted it to become. The envelope that started this journey sits framed on the study wall now, next to a photograph of Harold and me taken by a street photographer the day he collapsed. In the picture, I'm helping him stand, but if you look closely, you can see he's the one holding my future in his hands. This story isn't over. It's just the beginning. Because Harold didn't just leave me a mansion. He left me the understanding that every person has the capacity to save someone else, if they're brave enough to try. If this story moved you, if you believe in the power of second chances, show me by hitting that like button. Share your own stories of unexpected kindness in the comments. They might inspire someone who needs to hear that they matter. Subscribe to this channel because every month I'll share real stories about the Foundation's work, about people who've transformed their pain into purpose. Because the truth is, we're all just one catastrophe away from needing someone to see our humanity when the rest of the world looks away. And maybe, if we're lucky, we're also one act of kindness away from becoming the person someone else desperately needs us to be. Remember, you don't have to be rich to be generous. You just have to remember that every person you meet is fighting a battle you know nothing about. And sometimes, your smallest act of decency might be the thing that saves their life.